Hello, welcome to Bogan Intel. There's a lot of development going on in Venezuela at the moment. And over here in Australia, we don't really get much information from Latin America at the best of times, let alone around the complexities of a conflict on the verge of bubbling over as US naval and military encircle Venezuelan territorial waters and threaten to invade. To unpack some of the developments and some of the historical factors that led us here, Dr. Rodrigo Acuña comes to Bogan Intel to give us exactly that. Dr. Rodrigo is a Latin American expert with a PhD in Venezuelan studies. He's also a filmmaker and a Spanish teacher. Rodrigo gives a very detailed and nuanced breakdown, exploring Venezuelan history, Hugo Chavez, and his Chavista movement that came out of it, and lays and sets the stage for some of the political situations that see us here today. Thank you very much for coming at such short notice, Rodrigo Acuña.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we came across each other's paths around the topic of Venezuela, which is your land of birth. Am I wrong? Or sorry, you were born here and you have family from Venezuela.
No, so my background is actually Chilean. Both of my parents were Chilean. That's okay, common mistake, because people think that the country that you research is the country that you're naturally born in. But my background is that of Chilean parents, and I migrated here. We immigrated here at when I was just under a year, and in the early 20s, I went to university. I studied politics and Latin American studies. I then did a degree in education, and then eventually I did a PhD. And the areas of research became, or the areas of interest and research, I turned my focus towards Venezuela because at the time it wasn't understood what the government of Hugo Chavez was about. So that's how I ended up doing research on Venezuela and traveling to the country on many occasions. But I've also written extensively on Chile, and I've written about other countries. I've written about Cuba. I've written about Mexican politics, Peruvian politics, Paraguayan politics. I usually try on Colombia. I've got a few articles on Colombia, but I usually try and write about countries that I've traveled to and that I have I've read up on. So obviously Latin America is and the Caribbean is quite large, so you can't cover every country, but there are a few countries that I sort of specialize in, and my main I guess expertise is on Venezuela.
And of that expertise and experience, I've just checked out your documentary. That is it out yet, or
So we've done a couple of screenings around the
yep?
country, and our objective, our journalist Nicholas Ford and our objective is to eventually put it on a platform so people can download it and view it. Um, and we're hoping to do that by either the end of this year or early next year, because we still have a couple of screenings where we're doing around the country.
Yeah, look, it's really sort of impressive to view, and very beautiful looking documentary, well put together as well. And it was just quite strange, to be honest, to hear an Australian accent talking about Venezuela. I remember back in the early Chavez days as a young man in my 20s as well, trying to follow it from such distance here in Australia, and it was such a tectonic time in the region. And even though Latin American affairs are really far away here in Australia, it sort of stuck out. And the socialist element of it, and just the popularism of the movement coming from this like Bolivarian DNA that sort of implanted itself. And I remember this documentary. I think it was called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," And that was kind of like as close as you could sort of get to seeing what was sort of going on the ground there. And that was based around the coup there that was sort of organized after Chavez had really established himself as a popular character. So could you just give us a little bit of a background there to Venezuela, to potentially what was going on before Chavez, what was the status quo before, and what it meant to America, and then to potentially look at how Chavez sort of rose to power, and what was Venezuela like after Chavez took over?
So Venezuela, oil was discovered in Venezuela in the 1920s. And between that period, or you could say even earlier, um, up until 1958, the country had a series of governments, but they weren't very democratic, and there were two dictators that stood out. And the last dictator, Marcos Perez Jimenez, was overthrown in 1958 through popular popular mobilizations. And it's an interesting date because before, just after that, 1959 is when Fulgencio Batista in Cuba was overthrown. So the two countries have a lot of similarities in that regard. But while in Cuba you had the rebel movement of Fidel Castro and other rebel movements eventually consolidate their power and become what modern Cuba is today. In Venezuela, you had two political parties that made an agreement, and the agreement was called the Punto Fijo Agreement. And the two parties essentially agreed to share power and or rotate, sharing power. But what the agreement was essentially about was excluding the political left, or excluding forces that were going to challenge the structure of the society and challenge the core relationship with the United States. So during the Cold War, Venezuela is a very close ally of the United States. It's very close ally of the Kennedy administration. It supports the Kennedy administration in its economic blockade and attacks, terrorist attacks, really, on Cuba. And that positions the Venezuela very close to the United States, in the sense that by the time they nationalized their oil industry in 1976, everything had been done in such a manner that it's not to say that the nationalization was pointless or meaningless. It wasn't, but it wasn't going to upset the establishment and the relationship with the United States. So before that, in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Venezuela does play a role in supporting or creating the organization, OPEC, which is the petroleum cartel.
So it was an
And
original cartel member there.
well, yeah. Venezuela played a role in creating that organization, and the objective of the organization was to try and get the highest price of for oil on the international market, because these countries said, we have this finite resource, and it's not going to last forever, so we do need to try and make the most that we can. Now, while Venezuela played that role originally, into the Cold War, or I should say, into the from the 1960s onwards, Venezuela plays a counterproductive role, in the sense that it lobbies to lower the price of oil. So that's a contradiction, because it's a member of OPEC and it's supposed to be pushing for higher prices. But because it's such a close ally of the United States, it pushes for the lowering of oil. And that continues all the way up until Hugo Chavez comes to power in the late 1990s. Now, a turning point in Venezuela was that during the 1970s, there is a president. Oil is very high because of the crisis in the Middle East, and Venezuela does has a lot of money, but there's a huge contradiction in the sense that it's a very wealthy country, but there are also large sections of the country that are really poor, sort of the standard story of Latin America. Now, while there were rebel movements in the country, the movements were too small. They did have backing from Cuba, but they never managed to establish a foothold because the money coming in from the petroleum industry allowed for some middle class to, some sort of middle class to be established, and that meant that the country was even talked about as a role model of democratic stability. But by the 1970s, the
Like
government's
all the petro states were around that era as well. You know what I mean? Including
that's
Iran.
right.
There's so many similarities I'm hearing here with Iran, you know, and like essentially the loss of Iran is what Washington laments so much today. And in a
Exactly.
similar way, like it's the same with the loss of Venezuela, right?
Exactly,
Yep.
exactly, exactly. So despite that, all of this money's coming in, the governments also take out a lot of loans. And by the end of the 1980s, the government and the country's political system is in deep crisis. And they end up having or signing an IMF bailout package, a structural adjustment package, but the package indicates or states that there needs to be a sharp reduction in state spending. And that agreement was signed without the consensus of Congress. And the reaction of the general population is um, uh, just outright anger because one day they can afford, for example, the average bus fare, the average metro fare in Caracas, and the next day they can't. So it leads to a huge explosion throughout the country, starting in the capital, where people demonstrate and some people riot. And the Venezuelan military is then called out onto the streets to quell this dissent. But they also end up committing huge human rights violations. So it's not actually there aren't precise figures in terms of how many people were killed. From memory, I think the highest figures are close to 4,000. Um, Whether that's accurate, or I mean, I might not even remember correctly right now, but it certainly was high. It was either into the minimum would be in the hundreds, and maximum would be even a few thousand. Um, Now that triggered two attempted coup d'états in 1992. Now, what's interesting when we go back to the fact that Venezuela did not have large guerrilla movements or important guerrilla movements like in other Latin American countries, that meant that one of the presidents allowed for the military to come into contact with other sectors of society. So his name was Carlos Andres Perez, the president, and he allowed the military to go to university and do all their military courses, but also study sociology, study politics, and that put a section of the Venezuelan military into contact with civil society.
Mm.
And by the early 1980s, you have Hugo Chavez, who originally wanted to be a baseball player. He's not from the capital. And he decides that the only way that he can get to the capital is by joining the military.
Mm.
And he travels to Caracas. He works very hard and begins to rise up the ranks. But then he has a political outlook, and his conclusion is that Venezuelan society is A, deeply corrupt, B, there are huge amounts of inequality, and C, the relationship with the United States is there's a major imbalance. Um, and he also becomes inside the military. He just naturally he was just a very likable guy. Very certainly very rhetorical. But he was the MC in a lot of the parties inside the military, and he was also one of the experts on Simon Bolivar, who is one of the great, if not the greatest, independence fighter of Latin America against the Spanish Empire. So whenever the sort of the higher ups in the military needed someone to give a talk on Simon Bolivar, they would always say, well, why don't we just call this Chavez guy? This Chavez guy's read every book on Simon Bolivar. He was the expert. So he commences or launches an underground movement inside the military to one day try and challenge the establishment. Now, he's said that they weren't clear in terms of what they were going to do, whether they were going to try and carry out a coup or launch a political party. But during the 1980s, he's actually secretly organizing a movement inside the military. And when the military is used against the general population, obviously the lower sectors of society, in this rebellion in the late 1980s, 1989. It's called the Caracazo. Chavez speaks to other members of the military and says, this is shameful. I mean, what we've had to do is just absolutely unacceptable. We have a huge stain on our uniforms because we're not trained and programmed. Our objective is not to repress the average Venezuelan. Our objective is to defend the homeland against the foreign invasion. That's the core of our essence. So he organizes a coup d'etat in 1992, which is not successful. But despite the fact that it's not successful, because he himself was actually not able to take the capital, the other leaders of the coup managed to control most of the country. But for multiple reasons, he wasn't able to take the capital. So then there's a stalemate between the government and the coup plotters, and he participates or plays a crucial role in the negotiations. And he makes a call to the other commanders throughout the country to lay down their weapons. And he actually, part of the agreement was that he was going to be allowed to go on national television. And he says, look, I do assume responsibility for this coup. We have failed, but you have to understand that we are acting because this country, there are deep structural problems in this country. And he says, I mean, maybe it was a sort of a throwaway line, but he said something along the lines of, we haven't won for now, the famous por ahora. So that really endeared a lot of Venezuelans. And even though he was sent to prison for a few years, when he's released, he then decides to launch a political movement, and he wins with a significant majority. And just to highlight again how bankrupt the system was, the Venezuelan traditional parties decided to support a former Miss Venezuela from one of the wealthiest suburbs of Caracas. And this is a country where the levels of poverty were extraordinary. So he comes to power, and he's certainly less rhetorical than what he became, and he certainly talked more about fighting corruption. But once he's in power, he quickly begins to move the country towards a much more radical direction, and he challenges the United States in on many fronts. For example, he doesn't agree with the US blockade on Cuba, and he actually traveled to Cuba before he went to the United States, and that upset Washington straight away. He also
I'll never forget seeing that picture of Maradona, Chavez, and
and
Castro,
Fidel
Castro
Castro.
together. It's just an incredible photo to
Yeah,
see.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. They all became mates.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to wrap up this period, I mean, he then another policy that he pushes is that he prohibits the Venezuelan military participating with the U.S. military against the guerrillas in Colombia, and
Is that
Venezuela's
like the FARC
position,
rebels and things
the
like
FARC
this? Yeah, yeah,
rebels and
yeah.
the
Yep.
ELN, correct? So he says Venezuela is going to be neutral, and our position is that the government of Colombia needs to enter negotiations with the rebels. The rebels, you might not agree with all of their methods. You might not even agree with them ideologically, but the fact is that the rebels represent a significant uh, section of the rural peasants of the country, and they have genuine grievances. So
So
if
just
you're
to
not
interrupt
able
there,
to,
Rodrigo,
yeah,
so this is around Ingrid Betancourt happened around that bit
that's
later
right.
on.
She
That
was,
the
yes,
So,
yes,
but
yes.
but but so is the reverberations of the Chavista movement?
Mhm.
Did that unlock like a parlay in Colombia that led to the political environment we see today?
That Venezuela played a crucial role in talking to the rebels to come down and to sit down on the negotiating table,
Hmm.
and that was originally, I think Chavez was more supportive of them to continue the war, but Fidel Castro, and he was criticized a lot as well. he took the position that this conflict was just going to get worse, and the US was going to become more involved in Colombia, and this conflict was going to start spilling into other countries, which is actually what started to happen. So they Chavez changed his position and put the Venezuelan government actually participated, from memory, in the release of Betancourt. And certainly, it's well known that they participated in the final peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC rebels in 2016.
It's very interesting, and like you point to that power sharing arrangement, which seems to be like a bit of an imposition of the West upon countries. You see the functioning model of it happening in Germany, I suppose, like a super coalition scenario. Is there any similarities there between that previous government and something akin to a super majority, say what we're seeing in Germany, and increasingly what we're sort of seeing in Australia, I suppose?
You're talking about Colombia, or you're talking about
No, in
Venezuela?
Venezuela, back to Venezuela, to that government that kind of capitulated to Chavez.
Oh yeah, I mean that they weren't sharing power prior to Chavez winning, but they certainly worked strategically to try and defeat him, and then they became part of the opposition. They lost so much support that they are virtually non-existent in Venezuela anymore. They are a part of history now.
These mining countries that get, plundered by governments in cahoots, this bipartisan sort of scenario, the Tweedledee
Mm.
Tweedledum, it leads to, some problems in society. And I just think Australia, one or two social safety nets down, could potentially be looking at its own popular unrest one day against something like this. This could be echoing around the world, and it's an example that could be replicated. But look, I'll move on a little. Looking at the Chavista movement, as you said, it was charismatic. It had this traction, and look, the Venezuelans had this incredible star to sort of align their watches to, which was the spirit of Bolivar, which was born in Venezuela, right? In Gran Colombia, which was that region, right?
Yes.
So I mean, I always feel a bit jealous of our nations that have these sort of, these inbuilt revolutionary heroes that they can harken back to. But was the Chavismo movement, was it something that was automatically a threat to Washington, or were they seeking to sort of were they seeking to meet it in the middle somewhere, or straight away, or did they perceive it as a loss to them in the region, and something that had to be removed, and enemy from day one?
The pressure came on very, very quickly. I mean, um, taking that position regarding Colombia, for example, really upset Washington. Washington provided Colombia with, or created Plan Colombia, which was pouring billions of dollars into the country's military to fight the rebels. And the Colombian generals and the Colombian establishment were always crying that they needed more money and more guns. It became a whole industry. And when they weren't able to find rebels, they would kill campesinos, they'd kill peasants, and then they'd place machine guns next to them. Now, that's not to say that the rebels didn't control sections of the country. They certainly did. And in some places, they were actually very powerful. But again, the rebels, there's a whole story there as to why they became why they had such large numbers. The numbers that were given by the late 1990s were anywhere between 19 to 24,000 well-armed rebels. So that was a history of serious exclusion and serious repression against Colombian peasants, in with the objectives of just stealing their lands, pushing them away, pushing them off their lands. And there's a whole series of insurrections and rebellions and wars because of that. But by the time Chavez comes to power, he says, we don't want to be a part of that. We want to be a part of the solution, not the problem. And the same thing, as I said before, regarding Cuba. Cuba was and still is under a very harsh economic blockade, which essentially deeply hurts the average Cuban. It affects not only just trade between the United States and Cuba, but the United States penalizes third parties that decide to trade with Cuba. So if you have an Australian business and you would like to trade with, with Cuba, have some business operations in Cuba, if you have any interest in the United States, the US will place sanctions on you. There'll be penalties. You'll run into problems. Those two positions, and also Chavez became a voice critiquing neoliberal free market economics. This idea that you can privatize everything and everything can, you can make a dollar out of everything. And Chavez said, look, the majority of these policies were implemented through very brutal US-backed military regimes. Pinochet in Chile, Videla in Argentina, and the list just goes on and on.
And
And
today in Malaysia, Argentina, and in the
oh, they're back.
Nobel Peace Prize winners Venezuela too, right?
That's right. I mean, these ideas never could be sent, have never gone away, um, and that's what Chavez did at the time, and he then start very soon into. I mean, this is after he survived the coup d'état against him. He actually forms an alliance with Cuba, and what the U.S. had been pushing for during the 1990s was to create the free trade agreement of the Americas. And that was basically just getting all the Latin American countries to lower their tariffs and allowing the US to completely, penetrate Latin America economically. El Salvador adopted the US currency, Ecuador adopted the US currency. And although the US, you know, uh, policy makers would say, well, we don't want the Latin American countries to adopt our policy. The experts that were reading the situation at the time were saying, BS, that's exactly what they want to do. And Chavez became a voice against that. And he then formed the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas. And then he started getting countries to join this alliance. So he became, and not just him, obviously, the movement, and then the movement being in power in the state became a serious thorn for the United States, because it became, I would say, and I'm not alone in this analysis, the biggest geostrategic problem or threat for the United States since the Cuban Revolution, with the difference that Venezuela had oil dollars.
Mm. And when you look at the way those Monroe Doctrine countries have been treated post giving the finger to Washington, the sanctions on Cuba are just insane. 70 plus years of these incredible sanctions. I remember Obama, they were hoping that maybe Obama was going to slip back a little bit on it, and he just kept the line. Cuba will be punished into the ground until they change their ways. You look at Haiti, for example, just for having a revolution, and then you look at Venezuela, and you see the same thing. And I want to get onto that a little bit more later on about the Monroe 2.0, which I've spoken about a couple of times. And I mean, from what you can sort of see, and we will go next into these boat attacks and the impunity they're acting in the region, and even back to like Zohan Mamdani. On the left, there seems to be a political entitlement and an expectation in the United States towards being able to muck around in this region, and I'd like to talk to that a little bit more. But can we just sort of get to where we are right now? We've got like a massive military buildup in the waters off the EEZ of Venezuela there. We have B-52s flying over Venezuelan territory, and nuclear submarine. I heard a whole bunch of like really high-tech weaponry. And then we're seeing, what are we, 7 strikes and 32 dead, according to your article, and 0 charges on any of these people. So can you just give us a little bit more, if you can, about the victims and also about the boats themselves? Everyone's saying they're these streamlined like drug vessels, but these are boats that are thousands of nautical miles away from the American coastline and wouldn't be able to make the distance. So would you be able to just give us a little bit of information as to how America's spinning this one right now, and how Washington's, able to sort of prosecute their actions right now in the region?
Well, we don't know much about the victims because the victims have been blown to bits. We know that it's understood that one or two of the victims were Colombian citizens. Other victims were from Trinidad and Tobago, and the rest are apparently Venezuelans. The families, I would assume, are absolutely terrified. And what's understood is that these are basically either fishermen, or if they were people engaging in the drug trade, because yes, high-speed boats are used by people involved in the drug trade. We don't know anything else because there's nothing left of them. I mean, the US is releasing this footage. The US military is releasing this footage, and then saying these are alleged drug dealers, traffickers. But where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that that's actually taking place?
They say
And
the fentanyl glows in the water. You know what I mean? My God.
yeah, that's just garbage.
Ah,
I mean, the thing that what I discussed in my article was that the fentanyl, first of all, is predominantly moved into the United States through Mexico, and Colombia is the country where cocaine comes from, is exported to many parts of the world. Venezuela historically is not a major player in the drug trade. That's what the United Nations has to say. That's what numerous experts on the international drug trade have to say. And that's not to say that they're not involved, but in terms of the percentage and the operations, they're just not big players. That's the reality. Now, when you go back to the first Trump administration, his Secretary of Defense had to constantly um, talk him down in terms of taking military actions against Venezuela. Trump talked about firing missiles into Mexico. It had to be explained to him that if they did that, the Mexican government would consider that an act of war. He then replied, "Well, what if we just deny it?" And his advisors said, "The Mexican government will know that it was us that fired those missiles." He then talked about, for example, imposing a physical blockade, a physical naval blockade around Cuba. It was explained to him that again that would be seen as an act of war. So Trump was talking to his advisors during his first presidency about Venezuela, and he even said we need to get the oil. We've got to get the oil. And then he'd talk about, oh, those poor Venezuelans, they're suffering so much under Maduro. But then he'd remember that that we need to get the oil, which is really what he's interested in.
and that was
Uh,
John Bolton. He's now his frenemy, and now enemy number one, right? That was
there,
dealing
there,
with the
there
first
are actually
iteration.
Well, there are actually several advisors that have published their memoirs, that they just highly critical of Trump because they were there. They were part of the decision making process. So to go back to the first Trump administration, what eventually was presented to him was, what about if we just we launch the Navy, a section of the U.S. Navy into the Caribbean, and they are engaged in stopping drug smuggling operations. And Trump really liked that idea. He's like, yes, that's a great idea. So that's where the origins of this plan come from. But I think that it's looking maybe not fairly certain, but it's sort of heading in the direction that yes, the United States is most likely going to carry out some sort of a military strike on Venezuela. The question is, to what extent? How deep is that strike, or how large is that strike going to be? Is it going to be a few cruise missiles aimed at destroying 3 or 4 military bases? Is it going to be the type of strike that aims to actually kill the president of the country and the top echelon of the government? That is something that is not known. At least I'm not aware of that information.
just to be thinking about these options all of a sudden that Washington could be considering is just crazy. And, against the backdrop of all the moving parts Washington has around the globe, I mean, including the developments happening in Ukraine at the moment. And yeah, just the the breakfast in the Middle East. Uh, Rand Paul was on the news the other night, criticizing this measure, and it was I found it interesting. There's a few voices starting to pop up. I saw a Fox News person speaking up about the dangers of this, and Rand Paul was essentially getting to the point that if you're not at war with the country, and you're doing things like this, there's serious dangers to proceeding in this kind of manner. And if these fishermen are really the victims of these attacks, we can sort of see that potentially that's why Southcom commander stepped down, the naval commander,
That's
which
right.
is a big decision to make, and it could only be coming. It can't be a coincidence that it's coming around these actions that are clearly something that he can't swallow.
Mm.
So this thing is sort of it's building up, and we've just got these boats getting attacked, and these countries aren't officially at war. So, what precedent do you think this sets now going forward for maritime security? I mean, this is opening up a whole new kettle of fish. We haven't quite seen things like this. China's not doing it with Taiwan. This is a country just going hard up against someone's border with a navy and just buzzing them until they give them what they want. So, yeah, what does this say to the future in a multipolar world on the seas?
Well, I think it's more of an indication of where the US is at politically, domestically. The Trump administration is an authoritarian administration that is rapidly moving towards fascism. That's not a term that's to be used lightly, but with the creation of ICE and the how the judicial system in the United States has been coerced, and how the Trump administration is trying to coerce the media, and the number of some people would say concentration camps, others would still say detention centers, the number that are being built, and how people are being essentially kidnapped by this immigration force who cover their faces. They are essentially, almost acting like the brown shirts during the Nazi era. Um,
The brown
you know,
shirts revealed their faces in public most of the
well, the
time.
brown shirts did reveal their faces, but these guys
Mm,
have been informed not to.
yeah,
Um, and I think because
they're even
of how
worse.
social media, well, I think it's because social media, the way social media is used, and people have started to expose them. And there is a lot of pushback from many cities inside the United States, because they're now essentially just grabbing brown people, not just they'll go to areas where there'll be it's suspected that there are Mexican or Salvadorian, Latin American illegal immigrants. But then when they don't find when they don't meet their quotas, they've actually kidnapped U.S. citizens who are of a Hispanic background. And then they've deported them to a concentration camp in one of the largest prisons in Central America, in El Salvador.
Mm.
So the Trump administration is moving in this direction. And if you look at going back again to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, one of the elements of those governments was just to not even pretend to present deep or attempt to legitimize their actions. I mean, they would still provide, a public statement. This is why we are doing it. But it was just so obvious that the lie was not. It wasn't an elaborate lie.
They just barge through.
Um,
After a certain point, they'll just barge through, and that's what we're seeing. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So that what's happening in the Caribbean Sea right now, I think, is just an extension of the Trump administration. I mean, he talks so much about the Democrats and the pardon me, the Republicans historically um, being involved in wars in the Middle East, but then he renames the U.S. Defense Department or the U.S. State Department the Department of War, and gives this political style speech to the upper echelons of the U.S. military. I mean, I think he's clearly attempting to coerce the U.S. military to be used domestically, as he said in his speech, and as the U.S. Um, Secretary of State said. So that's again what they're doing in the Caribbean Sea is an indication of where the United States is at, where the U.S. government is at domestically, and what it's trying to achieve domestically.
But say like Trump has this really belligerent, as you say, the wheels are off and this guy's just
Mhm.
going for it. But it feels like with Venezuela and this re-emergence of the Monroe 2.0, that there is a little bit of a bipartisan consensus regarding Venezuela's like bad guy status. And a Democrat president usually just treads water, leaving it up to a Republican president to make the call whether or not the next thing can happen. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how that works. I mean, you wrote in your article, Trump is gunning for war in Venezuela. What is it? Raising fears of US-backed regime change. And you spoke of like a coup on the horizon, which is, the most favorable regime change vector point for the empire. But when we're looking at like bipartisan US admins pressuring Venezuela, and for 2 decades straight, or over 2 decades now, is there like an inevitability to this war that's on the cards
No,
with
no,
Washington? No.
nothing is ever inevitable. But that the US has been attempting to overthrow the government in Venezuela since 2002, that's just a fact. It was Obama who who declared Venezuela a security threat to the United
Right.
States.
Yeah.
It's a joke. Venezuela doesn't have nuclear weapons, and Venezuela doesn't fund international terrorism, and the list just goes on and on. And since the Bush administration, the Bush 1 administration, which supported the coup d'etat against Chavez, that's when economic sanctions against Venezuela commenced. So that there is bipartisan support to overthrow the Venezuelan government, there certainly is. The difference historically between the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to left wing or progressive administrations in Latin America is that the Democrats will always present themselves with a smile and a handshake. And Fidel Castro famously said, "I'd rather have the Republicans in power in the United States because at least you know who you are dealing with." But I think even Castro would never have imagined the Trump administration and how it's behaving.
JD Vance talking about, joking about the fishing. Oh, I wouldn't go fishing in that region anytime soon. It was just mind blowing. But to hear a vice president say something like that.
Well, they're dehumanizing. The Trump administration is dehumanizing everyone inside the United States that disagrees with them. If you saw that AI video that Trump made against the people that participated in the No Kings protest, he gets on board a fighter jet and then dumps manure on them. What he's doing is he's dehumanizing them. So first they're going to come after the illegal Latin American immigrants, then they're going to come out, and they're starting to do that already. Then they're just coming after any brown person, and then after that, they're going to come after, people that are politically progressive and outspoken, members of the left, and then they're going to come after the Democrats, and then they're going to come after anyone who just simply disagrees with them. That's how fascism works. That's how fascism has worked historically in Latin America. That's how it worked in Europe, and that's how it's going to work in the United States.
And like this is a hell of a lot of pressure on Venezuela from such a mighty power in the region. Patricia Murrins, who's an analyst, based overseas, she wrote up a bit of an analysis saying that there's rumors of 6,000 ground troops being prepared that are ready to go. There's an invasion plan, that there are people within the military that have been coerced into, joining the coup. Um, and I wanted to ask a little bit about this. I mean, we've heard, I think it was the Washington Post that claimed that Maduro, in a panicked way, had rang up Trump and offered access to all of his resources and markets and things like that to try and appease this incoming invasion. Is there any truth to that at all?
Um, the Venezuelan government itself apparently released the letter after it was leaked. So if that's the case, then we could say yes, it is true. but it doesn't. It shouldn't surprise us, considering the position that he has
Mm.
and how serious the threat is. What he is trying to do is he's trying to avoid a full-scale US military strike, which could include a full-scale US military invasion, which is going to kill tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. Nicolas Maduro, as the president of Venezuela, that is his job, to look after his country and look after his people. So certainly he's going to try and negotiate, and in those negotiations might make concessions which a government normally wouldn't. But I think it has to be understood under that context. And as I mentioned in my article, the Chavistas are aware that if they are removed through force, what's going to happen after that is a Pinochet style dictatorship. Now, for your audience who's not aware who Augusto Pinochet in Chile was, he was a very brutal US backed dictator for 17 years between 1973 and 1990. And once he took power, he made sure that the military and military intelligence and police intelligence went after every member of the Allende government. The Allende government was a progressive government that was in power, that nationalized the copper industry in Chile. And once they managed to get through all of the members of the government, or most of them, the ones that that were able to capture in Chile, then they started going after sort of the mid-rank members of the political parties, and then they went after the lower ranks, and then they went after the neighbor that once had tea with the local trade union leader,
Mm.
and because she had him over for tea or had her over for tea, well then she has to go as well. And you had people rounded up, taken to the national stadium, the national football stadium, beaten badly, tortured, and then eventually placed up against the wall and shot. And that's how fascism works. It is absolutely horrific. It is dehumanizing, and there should never be any compromise in trying to reject it politically. And that's the Venezuelans understand that. Now, what that means, it means two things. Number
May
one,
I ask? May I
yes,
ask though? Like, it's a very ubiquitous movement in Venezuela, the
mhm.
socialist movement there. Is it more of a popularist movement in Venezuela than say like Solidarity was pre-Pinochet in Chile? Solidarity
No,
for the Allende government,
yeah,
like,
no, I don't.
is there more of it?
Yeah,
Because you hear about these militias in
mm,
Venezuela, that they can field 4 million,
mm.
militias overnight and things like that. Like, is there a beating heart in the movement that will be a bit harder to dislodge, even with
Well,
a.
Well, that's the difference between Maduro and Salvador Allende. Maduro controls the military. The military is firmly, or so far has proven, I could be, things could change, but so
Yeah.
far the military has proven itself to be loyal to the government, to the constitution. And the Chavistas, for all of their faults and contradictions, they have always represented anywhere between 40 to as high as 56% of of the voting population. So they know that what I was saying before, that if the government is overthrown, what awaits them is a very brutal US backed military regime. So
We're seeing this in Syria right now, where you probably have 40 to 60% of the population of Syria that was sympathetic to something that came before, and now they are being hunted down by this empowered body. It's the worst nightmare of any nation that's facing the United States, and it's usually the same playbook that's meted out on them. Um, just to talk a little bit more about the industries and the private interests that might be running behind this, and the interest in Venezuela itself. Firstly, it'd be good to know how much of the rationale behind hitting Venezuela is about the resources and commandeering them. It has been said that there is more unexplored crude in Venezuela than any other country on earth, that has more volumes than any other country. Now, I just wanted to ask how much of these US industrial factors, and big assets are playing in the ultimate ambitions for the hydrocarbons inside Venezuela.
well, the Venezuelans have been successful in attracting Russian and Iranian and Chinese, but in particular Chinese investments. So
I saw those
the
floating oil derricks that had just
th-
gone up in the lakes and stuff like that. Yep.
that's right. So
Yep.
in the despite how severe the U.S. economic blockade has been, and mistakes that the government itself has made in the last 17 quarters, again, as I quote in the article, the Venezuelan economy has been recovering. So when I was there last year and walked into several supermarkets, what surprised me was two things. Number one, the supermarkets were full; they were well stocked. And number two, when I started having a look at the products, the pretty much all of them said made in Venezuela. So historically, Venezuela would import just about everything, and now they've shifted their economy where they've solved a lot of domestic shortages
Mm.
through a combination of state companies, but also granting loans and tax cuts to local businesses. So the economy has been stimulated and they have actually been recovering and growing. So that means that a prosperous Venezuela, a prosperous Venezuela is going to, it won't fit the mainstream media narrative, which generally is, when it comes to Latin America, it's set by the United States media. That's not going to work because other people in Latin America will say, well, sure, we might not agree with the Venezuelan government, but look at their economy. Their economy is actually doing quite well. Look at the infrastructure that they've built, and they have actually built an enormous amount of public housing in the last 20 years. They have built a lot of schools, they have built a lot of hospitals. They unsuccessfully at first tried to diversify their economy. That's always going to be a very big problem for them because it is predominantly, overwhelmingly, an oil economy. But I understand the logic of why policymakers in Washington would want to carry out a military strike and put an end to this experiment, because if it does become successful, then it becomes the threat of a good example. And the same thing has happened with Cuba. Cuba, despite the decades long economic blockade, Cuba has more doctors and teachers than almost every Latin American country per capita. And Cuba, for example, does better than just about every single Latin American country in the Olympics. Yes, the average Cuban does have, there's a shortage in terms of their dietary intake. Yes, their spending capital is very low, but Cuba is not a country that has kilometers and kilometers of slums with teenagers running around with AK-47s selling cocaine. That's Brazil. That's Colombia. That's Argentina.
Mm.
The Cuban Revolution, for all of its faults, and it certainly has many, many faults, and again, you might even disagree with it, philosophically on many fronts. But the Cuban Revolution has actually done a lot of good for the Cuban people, and that's why the United States has never, or at least until now, not been able to erode total support for the Cuban Revolution inside Cuba.
And yeah, like the inspiration that came from the Chavez movement was drawn out of Cuba, was drawn from Bolivar, and it seems like the region is always prone to having a bit of love for a populist leader that looks to think about the region first. I mean, it's modern Latin America has been fraught with needing to break away from colonial masters and from emerging imperial masters. So moving on to the ability of this movement to survive and for it to kind of thrive. I want to get back to, I couldn't believe hearing Mamdani essentially calling Cuba and Venezuela, what did he call them? I think I've got it here. He just called them outright dictatorships, right?
Authoritarian
Yeah,
dictatorships.
authoritarian
Yeah, yeah.
dictatorships. I can't believe that, when I see in the US and even to Australia and to some extent, just there's a very blanket viewpoint towards Latin American politics, in particular around Venezuela. It seems like the American political spectrum seems to be quite like laissez-faire about its approach to the region, under Trump or under Biden. And just to have someone like him just drop a call like that, what do you reckon that suggests about the United States and the way they perceive their own region, particularly as they start losing their clout in the world. If they can't police things in the South China Sea, if they're no longer able to make an impact in the, in the eastern, in Western Middle East, where are they going to take it out on the old region like they did in the old days, and really double down into the old Monroe Doctrine? Do you think there's a chance of this happening?
Yeah, certainly, because that's their interests have been else. Their focus has been elsewhere, predominantly in the Middle East, and moving away from the Middle East, or having a Middle East where Israel can be its local sheriff. Then they can return their focus to Venezuela, to Cuba, and Marco Rubio has played a very important role in this. I mean,
Yeah.
he's of Cuban heritage, and
And
he
he's got a
comes from that.
particular ideological like
Oh, he comes from
imprimatur.
that Miami. Yeah,
Yeah,
he
yeah,
comes from that Florida, Miami right wing, ultra right wing
yeah.
Cuban American community. I mean, they were heavily tied into and were part of the Batista regime that was overthrown by Fidel Castro and the rebels. So they lost billions and billions of dollars in Cuba. They had their sugar mills expropriated. They had their large haciendas expropriated. They were kicked out with the American mafia. So they have a grudge. That's an intergenerational grudge that they hold, and they've also been joined by the Venezuelan or sections of the Venezuelan elites that have moved to either Miami or Madrid in Spain. So they also have a grudge and would like to see both. And I'll throw in Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega in there as well. But going back to your point regarding how someone like Mandani can make these sorts of comments, you have to remember that for decades, in fact, longer, Latin America has never been given the respect and the appreciation that it merits. I mean, that's part of the reason why I do what I do. Is I don't think other people have the right to tell our story. Our story should be told by us. And if you want to have a dialogue with us, well, fantastic. We'll sit down and have a dialogue with you. But what you don't have the right to do is to send journalists to the region, for example, that don't speak Spanish or Portuguese.
Mm.
And a lot of the mainstream media are notorious for doing that. They'll parachute them in and they'll interview members of, especially if there's a center left or a progressive or radical government in power. They'll interview sections of the opposition who are Western educated, US educated, European educated, and already speak English. And then they might grab one or two quotes from the government out of a press release, and then that's it. Their job is done. They've understood Venezuelan politics. I mean, I met one of these journalists, I think from Forbes, when I was there on one of my many travels, and I just absolutely smashed her when I was having, just a conversation with her. I was like, oh, that's, what do you know about Venezuela? Where have you been to? Oh, that's, oh, so you're just here for 3 days, and do you speak any Spanish? And she didn't speak any Spanish, but she was flown in, and I mean, so this sort of stuff preconditions people to think that what can come out of Latin America. It's like you think, well, what can come out of the Middle East, or what can come out of countries that are viewed and may actually, in fact, be very poor economically, but historically and politically and culturally, they are in fact very rich. And if you look at places like Latin America, where people organize against incredible odds and incredible violence, if you are a person that's willing to learn and you're humble, what you'll actually do is take a little bit of that wisdom and say, wow, that's actually quite inspiring. That's really interesting. How did that society develop in to the extent to where they're at right now? What are their previous problems? What are their current problems? What may be their future problems, their solutions, etc., etc. So that is something that the mainstream media does not offer on Latin America, and that's why someone like Mandani can make those sorts of statements. And there's also just a sense of superiority there, thinking that
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
what is, like, I mean, I've had conversations like this with members of the ALP where it's like, okay, so you support public housing and you support public education and you support a public healthcare system. And, if you talk to the older ones, I say, oh, resources, the foreign multinationals should pay a lot more than what they're paying. Well, I'll say, okay, well then you're pretty much a, that those positions in Latin America make you a radical, because the things are just much more extreme over there. But if you think about it in a sort of more cool, sensible manner, they're not really radical demands. They're actually demands that you can still have a working business community. You could still have good economic relations with the United States or whatever power you have to deal with. It's just you simply want to cut the pie up in a fairer manner.
With Venezuela, it feels a bit unique, like the animus put on it compared to say other like focal points from the US. With Iran, there's always like this kinetic threat of Iran having this ability to like cause havoc with their weapons in the region. With North Korea, it's the same thing, right? These axis of evil countries, but Venezuela's never really been accused so much of being like this imminent like military threat that's going to like roll out and conquer the lands
Because
around
it's
it.
not.
Yeah, it's been always seen as an ideological threat. And like maybe back in the McCarthy era days of, it was much easier to sell a purely ideological threat on its own and remove it. But now it's not enough. It's kind of like, oh, so what, you just don't agree with the guy. He's not exactly like starting World War III here. He's trying to be reasonable with Washington as well as all his partners in the region. So it does stick out a little, blows my mind away a little bit to see these center progressive left people. Not only can they, somehow picture a war with Iran based on, I don't know, women's rights without thinking about how many women are going to get destroyed taking Iran. They can also like somehow excuse America doing something with Venezuela with regards to an ideology or some kind of problem they can't even quite put their finger on. And it's just after all the mistakes we've made in the West over the global war on terror, it's incredible to see everyone just lining up again on the progressive left. The mainstream progressive left, just to kind of let this thing wash over again. I wanted to move on to the next thing, and that's like Venezuela's ability to defend itself. And we had President Petro of Colombia and figures in Brazil. I saw a clip with MST leader Stédile, and they've been vocal, essentially saying that they're willing to touch one, touch all here. And there's been rallying cries in the region about like maybe a Bolivarian revivalism regarding allies or something like that. Firstly, I want to ask you a little bit about Venezuela's capacity to be able to withstand whatever could happen if it was kinetic. And also ask you, is this a galvanizing moment for the region? Could these actions by Trump really be setting the DNA for another independent kind of revolution in Latin America?
Well, in terms of your first question, Venezuela has about 20 21 to 24 operational Russian aircraft Sukhoi fighter jets, which are not the elite, top of the line stuff that the Russians themselves have. This is the stuff that they sell internationally, but they're still very good jets that will cause problems for the United States. Um, can the US Air Force destroy all of those fighter jets? Yes, they could. Are they going to lose fighter jets themselves in the process? Yes, they will. Venezuela has invested a lot in surface-to-air missiles. Will a lot of the US or a percentage of those US aircraft be destroyed in a full-scale invasion of Venezuela? Again, yes, they will. Will some of the US Navy be destroyed? Yes, they will. And what history teaches us is, or what it has revealed, the pattern, is that after the US invasion of, or their intervention in Vietnam, the US likes to pick fights that it can win quickly. It doesn't want wars that are going to be, prolonged conflicts. They may end up being that, in the sense of, in the cases of both Iraq and Afghanistan. But in terms of just overthrowing the government and then placing their local puppet in power, they were able to do that. And there's no country that can really, I mean, other than this, obviously the superpowers, Russia and China, most countries in the world cannot withstand a full-scale US military assault. So the Venezuelans will fight, and they'll fight very hard. But after a couple of days, or if not a couple of weeks, the US would be victorious. I haven't read anyone that has suggested otherwise. But the problem for them will be, again, the Chavistas, the people that have supported the government for the last 20 plus years. And the number of AK-47s that the government has given to the militias that support it. So the
So any
theory
puppet
behind
government would always be beset by, you know, a decentralized Chavismos, Chavistas everywhere
oh,
throughout the country.
The
Yeah.
Chavistas are gonna be firing their AK-47s for years if they are invaded and Maduro is overthrown. Have no doubt about that. They will do that because they will be deeply resentful that their government was not voted out of office. There was no peaceful transition. It was a violent one, and all of the government's programs, the amount of social mobility that has taken place because of this government, all of that will be destroyed. So you're going to see people that are going to be physically destroyed. Then the policies that their government supported be destroyed, and it's going to be a direct assault on their ideology. And Venezuela, why is Simon Bolivar such a big deal? He's a big deal because he not only liberated Venezuela and Colombia against the Spanish Empire, he also organized military generals in other parts of South America to fight against the Spanish. So
Is that like
eventually,
La Paz, the center of the plains and all those kind of
the
guys? Yeah.
that's Bolivia. That's Bolivia is actually named in honor of Simon Bolivar. So
Yeah.
Bolivar is considered to be the founder of five republics, not one, five republics in South America. And while that's the case with those five countries, the other countries' generals were also in contact with Simon Bolivar. I mean, yes, they'd have to send messages on horseback, and the messages would arrive 3 weeks later, but they still knew who he was, and they still ended up, talking to other members of the colonial forces that agreed that they should break away from the Spanish, and he played such a dominant role. So to go back to your comments about the leader of the MST, I certainly would not be surprised if Latin American youth entered into Venezuela to defend the Bolivarian Revolution, especially if this conflict became a prolonged conflict. I mean, they've you know been chanting, creating chants about Venezuela becoming the next Vietnam. I mean, they are psyching themselves up for a serious confrontation. And I think it certainly will be one after the Maduro government, if the US were to engage in a full scale invasion. This is going to be a conflict that's going to last many, many years.
And this is also happening at the same time as all these kind of neoliberal nightmares like Malay's government in Argentina are reaching like boiling point and they're about to kind of collapse. And that model's not working out. Then the Venezuelan alternative is another version of that, which will also be resisted. So another factor here that's always been present, and you mentioned it with regards to investment, is Russia and China. Russia militarily being quite, important for Venezuela. China also militarily to an extent, but mostly, just a very big economic partner. But there's been a lot of silence in statements or memos or things like that coming out of Moscow or Beijing. And I'm wondering if that's a bit of a worrying sign for Venezuela, if there might be some great power or parlay that's happening right now between Russia, China, and America, a bit of a divvying up of the spoils that maybe China and Russia are saying to Washington, okay, now you can have your region, but that means that we're going to have ours one day or something like that. And I just wanted to run that by you a little bit, and just ask you what role do great powers play in this region that's looking to be dominated by the US.
Well, China has been the only foreign power that's been able to penetrate Latin America economically outside of the United States. The Russians weren't able to do it during the Cold War, and that, while yes, British and French capital have long been present in terms of a hostile power to Washington. The only one that's managed to do that is Beijing. And Trump, by simply threatening Panama to invade the country, a country which was invaded by the United States in 1989 and saw anywhere between 3 to 5,000 people killed. That was enough to scare the living daylights out of the Panamanians, and they quickly made deals to end their relations or wrap up their relations with Chinese capital, because they don't want to be, faced to have to face that situation again. Um, do the great powers make agreements regarding their spheres of influence? Well, of course they do. Of course they do. I mean, James Baker, after or during, just before the end of the Cold War, said to the Russians that the US would not move, would not expand NATO, and if they allowed the reunification of Germany, and that's exactly what they did afterwards. They actually expanded NATO. So Russia, and I'm not, I'm not a fan of Putin or anything like that, but Russia has been acting or has been issuing warnings for a very long time now about the expansion of NATO. So yes, there could very well be a trade-off taking place. Secret negotiations between the United States and Moscow, the United States and Beijing, and whether we're ever made aware of that, of those negotiations. Well, that remains to be seen. But I wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't rule them out. I mean, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the agreement that was made between Khrushchev and Kennedy was that the Russians would remove their nuclear missiles from Cuba, and the United States would commit itself to never invading or imposing a physical blockade on Cuba. And that's what occurred, and it occurred without the knowledge of the head of the Cuban government. So Castro was absolutely furious when he was informed that the missiles were going to be removed. And that's exactly it. That was a play between Washington and Moscow, and the Cubans were the last ones to be informed.
Yeah, it's like when the superpowers start rolling around, the world gets the bloody knees, right? When the superpower coughs, the
Exactly.
world gets the flu. As someone who analyzes the region, Venezuela, who has seen like the political developments in Colombia and how it contrasts against some of, say, the right wing governments that are happening maybe further south. What do you think the future looks like for firstly for Venezuela and for Latin America under the gaze of a United States that's really starting to look back to that old muscle memory in the region?
Not pleasant, not pleasant at all. Very dangerous, very, very dangerous. I mean, having the Republicans in power has always been far more problematic than the Democrats, and the Democrats haven't been nice either. But having a fascist United States in power, well, that could mean, again, a full-scale invasion of a large Latin American country like Venezuela, and the cost being millions or hundreds of thousands of people. Um, I think under those circumstances, how can a peace movement develop inside the United States to oppose a war in Venezuela if the United States itself is living under fascism? Under fascism, you can't go out onto the streets and protest because the military's out on the streets. That was the case with Chile all throughout the 1970s until the early 1980s, when people began to lose their fear and decided to go out and demonstrate. And up until the very end of the Pinochet regime, those protesters were always met with very harsh repression. So what happens inside the United States is going to have a big impact on Latin America. If the Trump administration consolidates its power and creates an authoritarian state, a fascist, even a theological state, because it's the radical Christian right that are in bed with Donald Trump, then you could have a fascist theocracy in power in the United States, and that would be horrific for the world and horrific for Latin America.
Definitely. Look, I'll get this one last question for you. It's more one for me. I might cut it out. I'm very interested in this one because I've spoken to, like, say, socialists over the years. But I wanted to ask a question because, if I speak about some of these national socialist stories. It's a hard one to use those two words together, but you could look at Vietnam, you look at Cuba, you look at Venezuela, where there's China, where there's been these characteristics, these national characteristics that have been applied to the socialist movement. And generally, they've been the secret sauce that's kind of kept them buoyant in a world that wants to see them disappear. Just wanted to ask you, do you feel that there's a bit of a segregation as far as international solidarity is concerned with socialism and what's going on in these poor countries? It feels like, if I spoke about Venezuela, they would say, no, they don't meet the requirements of international socialism, of this Western idea of like Trotskyite, blah, 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 blah. And I just wanted to know if you had a comment on that at all.
Certainly, because again, it stems from a lack of understanding, or just a genuine attempt to understand the region. So again, while people that call themselves, socialist or part of the political left, they may quite genuinely demand policies, push for policies that are going to create a more equitable society in Australia or the United States. They can also be racist, whether they are even aware of it or not, because they simply view other parts of the world as lesser than them. And you may ask them, well, do you think there are any thinkers from, in this case, my area of expertise, Latin America, that you might be aware of, or have you read any novels from Latin America? I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, one of the great Colombian novelists, if not the greatest, he's been now banned. His book 100 Years of Solitude has been banned in the United States. It's now on the list. That's one of the greatest novels that's ever been written, in my opinion, because it's telling you, it's informing you about the history of Colombia through a microcosm of this fictional town called Macondo. So I think just our just the culture, the culture that is established, that's promoted, just tends to look at people from other parts of the world as either in Latin America, yeah, interesting food, maybe nice food, the music's great, but there's a lot of drug dealers and there's a lot of poverty down there. The Middle East, yes, and then you just keep going with these sort of very broad and even racist classifications.
Mm.
And that is, it's a shame, because the progressive side of politics are also affected by that, and they don't attempt to genuinely understand these countries and the people that live in these countries. And the way you try and break that down is by traveling there. I also think that the fall of the Soviet Union had a huge impact, because the Soviet Union, yes, it was a one-party state. Yes, it was repressive. Again, I wasn't a fan of the Soviet Union, but there were, I guess, benefits from the Soviet Union being around for the third world, the developing world, because they talked about other parts of the world. Their
That's
press
right.
published authors from other parts of the world,
And
and
when the
people
Cold War
were.
was when the Cold War ended, you just had a whole bunch of people in the West that had never had their toes or thumbs in the pie at any point, telling everyone how it was.
Oh, exactly, exactly. And I lived through the Cold War. I mean, I was very young, but I grew up in a very political family, so I remember a lot of discussions from that era, and that was something that, you had two giant superpowers, and both of them were pumping out their propaganda, and it was propaganda, but with all propaganda, there's also an element of truth, and part of the Soviet propaganda was that there was this other world, and this other world had interesting things to offer, and there were interesting things happening in this other world. And the US version of the other world was simply drug dealers, sheikhs in the Middle East that were dodgy, just sort of stereotypes, just and as I've said repeatedly, racist stereotypes. So that is something that progressives and political left and socialists, etc., they suffer from, those being victims of those stereotypes, instead of, again, trying to just attempt. I mean, it takes years to get to a level where you could call yourself some sort of an expert. But you don't have to become an expert. You simply just have to have an open mind. You simply have to, as you've done. This is a very good, you're a very good example. Just to reach out. Let's just have a conversation. Let's have a respectful, constructive conversation, which is what we're doing. And I'm learning things from you. You're learning things from me. And then we continue. We're always trying to grow. Have a growth mindset. Mainstream media doesn't do that. The corporate media doesn't do that. And that's again the general population is poorer for it.
I agree. And, this ideological terra nullius here seems to, it seems to really compound in this nation as well. Girt by sea all the way down here at the bottom. And with an inability, our own inability to even like use our peripheral vision to even see where we are geographically, um, see who's around us. It's very hard to have some of these conversations in this country. And it's so good to have someone on like yourself to shed some light on just an incredibly serious development that's happening in the world. In a country where we don't really see or hear much of. So, look, I just can't thank you enough for coming on, and I've just learned so much from having you on today personally. So, potentially, as things move on, hopefully for the better for Latin America, I'd love to have you on again in the future.
I'd love to be back. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much.